to Cultivating Genius. I want to share a little bit about myself and what I've done over the years. And I've been involved in ski coaching and ski teaching for about 35 years now. I've been doing this. I started teaching skiing back in 1986. I eventually started doing back-to-back winters. I did 9 back-to-back winters from 91 through 99. And during that time, I was on snow about 200 to 250 days a year. Then I continued to stay highly involved where I would live, eat, and breathe, either teaching, coaching, being a program director, head coach. It was my life. So I think that I can argue that I have a lot of experience, but I'm also the first person to tell you that experience is the most overrated attribute anybody can claim. With just having experience only makes my life easy to basically step in and do my job. It doesn't make me great at it. If we want to be great at something, we have to continue to grow. We have to continue to question. We have to continue to seek outside sources for information and learning. And that's a little bit what we're going to touch on as we go forward in this presentation. So going to the next slide. Are we performing malpractice? Now I'm going to play something for you. So hopefully this comes across on your.
Welcome to the Way of Champions podcast. I'm your host, John O'Sullivan. Every week, we connect you with the top minds in the world of sports, coaching, leadership, and building championship programs so you can take your athletes and your teams to the next level.
Neurosurgeons say, if I practiced neurosurgery the way I did 18 months ago, I would be sued for malpractice. The orthopedic surgeons and the cardiac surgeon guys, they'll say, if I practice my form of surgery now the way I did just 5 years ago, I'd be sued for malpractice. Well, I offer to your listeners that many of the ways you are teaching now, I should be suing you for malpractice because you haven't kept up on how you learn faster. You're sticking with the old, hey, I learned it this way myself, right? And I'm teaching the way I was taught cycle that we're not breaking out of.
Hey, everyone, welcome to the Way of Champions podcast.
All right, so a really good podcast they came across. Let's jump to the next slide. This is the Way of Champions podcast 286. If you guys have never heard this, I highly recommend going to it, listening to it, and specifically this one and what they speak to. But the fact is the model we've been using for coaching skiing for the last 30 years has changed very little. And if we believe what they have to say in this podcast, as well as a lot of the other research that's out there, we need to start taking a look at how we do things and how we can change. And this includes the way, looking back and looking at the way I was coached, or any one of you have been coached. If you're coaching the same way you coached 20 years ago, it's time to take a look at how you can grow and be different, and how the sport is evolving, how coaching is evolving, because there's so much research out there. So hopefully you were able to take the little test, but if you didn't, I'd like you to take a moment and answer these questions real quickly. And then we're gonna actually look at some athlete math as we move forward here. So we can jump to the next slide. And about 10 years ago, I performed an experiment, and my goal was to really understand how much time we could get in a day of training. And so I had some of the athletes use their watches. They would get off the chair, they'd hit their watch as the moment they began to slide. And then they would turn it off when they got to the lift, or if they stopped to talk or waited in line. And I repeated this a few times, and it was quite shocking to me. It was actually a turning moment in my coaching when I took the time to absorb this and recognize that the information that it gave me. So let's jump to the next slide. We can kind of use some basic math here to recreate what I found out through this experiment. And I asked the question earlier about if we have 30, if we're speaking about our U12 race team athletes. So if we have 35 days of training, and if we can assume that you can get 20 runs in a day, and this is pretty generous, I believe. And then if you get 3 minutes of sliding time in one run, and again, I'm being generous here, then we can get 60 minutes of sliding time. And then we have to deduct a few things from there. And that's kids will be goofing off. There's going to be some lost time in lift lines, weather, lift stopping, going to get a waffle, whatever it may be. It really gets reduced from there to about 45 minutes at absolute best. And then if we have to compensate for travel and race days and other losses, we're down to about 30 days of training. So if we take 30 days, 45 minutes, we're looking at 26.25 hours of training per season. And looking at the results, people were a bit off there. I gotta look at my results here. I would say it looks like over 50, actually almost 75% have 45 hours, actually 90 hours or greater. So as we can see, we're a little bit off, and this sheds an enormous amount of light on how much time we don't have if we're going to be successful at training. So Mike, let's go to the next slide. And if we go to the next slide, oh no, not that one. Go one. Let's go back one. Thanks, Jacqueline. The question that I pose to you is, would you change your answer to these? Would you change how much free skiing now that you know that most of us were off in our assumption of how much time we have in a season? If you only have 28 hours, and I'm rounding up there, 28 hours, and over half of you answered that would be that you should have 25% free skiing. That's only 20 hours, 21 hours of training. So, and this doesn't account for the fact that if we're training on warm up and you're going from the bottom of warm up to lift, that's free skiing. And if we're doing laps off the top of the mountain, you're skiing from the top of Vadel down to the course, there's more free skiing. So if we had a course set every day for the entire length of training, we'd still give up almost another 50% that we would be dedicating to free skiing. So really the question in here is, I've heard this over and over and over again for 30 years about how we have to have a lot of free skiing. It has to be built in. And I'm saying, you know what? It's built into our skiing. We actually have to look to how to maximize our time on snow and how do we get the most out of that. And we'll dive into the curriculum piece, but I'm trying to lay the foundation for you all of why we're making the decisions we make and why I have the philosophy I have for the program in terms of structuring it the way I see best to move forward. So any thoughts? Anybody that wants to share their thoughts on that? Was there anybody completely surprised? Moshe?
Yeah, I was just to play devil's advocate. I think I'm very closely aligned with your perspective, but I think that there is sort of a baseline to consider of kids just to love skiing, and so I think that there's sort of this. I think of it as almost like a striated stack where there's a baseline of where kids just need to love to be on snow and sliding on snow. At some point, something clicks. I don't know what it is. It's desire, and something else takes over. And so the question I would have, or I'm sure you're going to address it, is when do you implement a lot of environments and structure? Because we all began skiing free skiing. So there's my comment.
So yeah, when do we add that structure in? Well,
Right.
one, if we have a race
Right.
program, it should be added in there. And as I just said, if we trained every day in courses and it was on warm up and they were going off the top of the mountain, half the day would be free skiing. So I'm going to argue that it's there. It's built into the day in and day out. Plus our training block is only 5 hours and the lift runs for 8. So most athletes will have the time to free ski with their friends. And I encourage that. And I believe that does have to happen outside of our training program. And I am not saying that every athlete and every program, we need to be in environments or courses all the time. What I am saying is that we do have to maximize what we do. And it's this argument that's been going on about free skiing. No one's taking the time to do the math. And that's all that I'm doing is saying, hey, look at the math. Look what it's telling us. We're a weekend holiday program and our kids are going to get 28 hours of training in or less. That's it. And so what should we do with that time? And it's trying to get everyone to think about that. But every athlete's at a little different stage when they get to us. And this is part of the reason we have different teams. It's why we have a development team. It's why we have the race team. It's why we have the factory team. And even within those teams, they might get broken up again based on the desire of that athlete and where they are in their development and their desire mostly. So good question, Moshe. Hopefully I answered that without dodging it too much. Are we on the next go? Let's go ahead and jump.
There's a couple other questions out there.
Oh yeah. All right. Let's, who's got a question?
Yeah. Does guided free ski count as training time or free ski time?
It can be whatever you want. It's not free ski time, but what can you get out of it? And actually the next slide, we take a little bit deeper look at that, but that's a good question. Let's see if I can answer it when we get to the next slide. Anyone else? Okay, so let's look at this next slide. And I use this, I use soccer a lot as a reference, football to the rest of the world, because there's so much data on it. There's so many athletes and so many countries that play this. It's the biggest sport in the world by far. It's probably has the most research around it. And so we can really pull a lot of information from it. And I brought this scenario up because I could make the argument of what is a kid who is standing at one end of the field and he kicks the soccer ball and he runs down to it and he gets to it and he turns around and kicks it back. And what element, and I'm going to throw this question out there and see if anybody, what does this lack specifically in terms of training? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Write it in the chat. There's two things I believe that it's missing from it being successful as a training element. Like, why doesn't this work? Why is this kid who does this not going to make it to the World Cup? Anybody? The biggest thing, okay, I'll take it, is that it lacks consequence. There's no consequence. The kid can kick it. It can go right. It can go left. It can go far. It can go short. No big deal. He runs down and get it. So if you look at number 2, this also lacks consequence. It has a little bit more. They have to kind of get it, but the kid's going to move left or right. He's going to get the ball and kick it back to you. But again, there's just not a lot of consequence. As you move to the target, and it doesn't matter whether it's 2 meters by 2 meters or 2 inches by 2 inches, you've now added some reference and some feedback. And so it becomes part of the feedback loop. And because there is consequence, they're trying to hit a target. As you move to number 4, this is the only one that has decision-making. And this is a really critical element that is added. And this is one of those things that have come out in research over the last bunch of years, is that athletes need to be making decisions on the fly. It's part of what makes them great. So again, in our training, and the research tells us the answer is really number 4 by far. If you want results, number 4 is the answer. So if you go down that path, so what would be the equivalent of that in terms of getting effective training and getting the athlete to change the way they're skiing. And that's where we're speaking to the fact we want them to get better and we want them to change. So we're granted, of course, we want them to love skiing, but our job is to make them change. That's what coaching is all about. So if we ask that question and we look at the right side of the slide, where does 3v3 fit in to our training model?
Closed environment training
Yeah.
and deliberate practice.
All right, closed environment training. I would say yes. I would say that is part of it. Deliberate practice. I don't think so. I don't think drills or deliberate practice really equates to 3v3 because it lacks. There's too much open space. There's not enough consequence. Even doing a drill when you're asked of it, I so often see drills being performed very poorly. So if it's being performed very poorly and there's no feedback loop, if they don't fall down, if they're doing a drill and they don't fall down, there's no feedback loop. If no one stops them every 3 turns and goes, that's wrong, this is how it needs to be done, they're not closing the feedback loop, and therefore there's no consequence. If a kid kicks a ball at a 2x2 target and misses it, he knows right away that was no good. So when we stick things in the ground or we create a situation, whether it's even a coach saying, I need you to make 30 turns from here to here, and then you need to stay on this side of the slope and do this drill, now we start to create a little bit of constraint and consequence to it. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what we do in terms of what we stick in the ground. It doesn't need to be a race course, but we do need to create situations that constrain space, time, and distance. And this starts to have some consequence.
I'm piping in last minute here, but from the question you asked, Sean, if you can hear me, do you hear me?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
What the response to your question, I think it's competition. It's actually, these kids need to compete with each other. The 3 versus 3, just the fact that, one accomplishes something and somebody needs to accomplish it better than the other person.
Sure. There's an element of competition. There's an element of failure and success. I would agree that's part of it. And it actually speaks to the whole concept of core drills that we've created here at the Race Factory. And that is actually a scored drill system that really creates, it puts some specificity into doing drills, very specific elements that we look at and say, you need to do this, this, and this if you're going to get scored properly on this. So that's another way to create that. And if you have 20 athletes doing it, they're all going to be trying to up each other. It's kind of part of what we do, and we're in competition. So,
well, competition's a funny word. It's very broad, and I like the word, but the thing that strikes me about competition, or when I first heard that, what I heard was, playing a full game, like a sanctioned event. And I think the spirit of the 3-on-3 is that you get more time. So you're in a competitive environment, but you're actually in environment, which is to say you're doing the thing more than you would be if you were playing on an 11x11, right?
absolutely. And that's what the research is telling us. And that was one of the key points that came out of, that has come out over the research, that 3-on-3, and they also, they reduce the space that you have to work in. Goals are tiny. The accuracy has to be better. You have to be quicker. So there's a lot of elements. So absolutely, I agree with you, Moshe, 100%. And also the comment about competition, that competition is a really broad term, and fully agree.
Yeah, I wonder if you could call that desire instead of competition, not to be too singularly focused on language, but I do think that's like individual desire, whereas competition has kind of an external component to it that in our environment here, we're talking about creating effective drills with focus in constrained environments. I think it's speaking to that idea of desire. That's just
Yeah, I agree
right.
for sure.
But Moshe, don't you find that your kids in environment, even if you're not making it a competition, they're competing against each other? They might not be doing it like they talk to each other like, hey, I did that without falling, or I did that quicker than you.
Yeah, sure. But but I would say more than anything, I think they're challenged by the structure more than they are. I think I think about it like golf, right? It's never you against the other player. The outcome,
Unless you're betting, then it is.
unless you're betting. But I think it's the outcome fundamentally is you against the other player. But the thing you're doing has nothing to do with the other person. It's mastery over space. And so therefore, you have to be careful with this idea of competition. I never try to put athletes, head to head against one another.
You don't have to. That's the whole point of this situation, right? And I agree with the competition thing, but they naturally will want to compete again. That they're trying to succeed because that's natural in them, right?
Yeah, sure.
You don't have to hit them.
Yeah, but I mean, in that it's I don't know that I would use the word competition with all that, the baggage on that word. I think the sentiment is right. But I think I would use the word challenge or desire because it's fundamentally, it's internally driven.
Yeah.
Like no kid who is not internally driven is going to go through down any of these sets. Like they either are or they aren't.
Agree. Agree.
Gamify. How's that, Moshe? Gamify.
Gamify. All right. I like that. It's a very millennial word. Suppose.
Yeah. So there's a comment here about small-sided games, 3v3. They naturally have more touches. We're actually going to speak to that concept, the idea of touches and how it impacts our training. This is absolutely 100% true that increased touches is a critical element in the success of the 3v3 or 4v2 or whatever you're doing in those worlds. That increases touches. And so we will take a look in our next webinar about touches and how do we translate that same principle into our training, the idea of more touches. While we're still on this slide, we talked about decision making. I think it's important to think about repetition because I think repetition mirrors a little bit the concept of touches. And does having fun matter? And this is really important. I want you all to contemplate this. And also, can we experience joy without fun? And this is another one of those pet peeves of mine, to be honest with you. Oh, we got to make it fun. Moshe, you said it in your presentation I watched the other day. Getting on a roller coaster is fun. Going for a ride on a roller coaster. But you sit there and you're along for the ride. Playing a video game, that might be fun. What kids do for fun is different than the concept of experiencing joy through training. And if they're there to learn and they want to learn, it's amazing how many will find joy in training. And I think this is kind of the gift that each and every one of you need to bring to the table, is this idea of how do you create situations that make it joyful, that is also challenging. But I think it's kind of bogus to think, it's got to be fun. Like, sorry, I don't buy in on that. There's plenty of time for fun, and our training time is short. We've proven that with the math. Let's be effective. Let's help them find joy in it, but we don't need to make it fun. So that's my personal belief. I'm happy to hear what you guys think down the road. We can think about this. And I want everyone to understand, one of my objectives with this is to keep these short, to drop some nuggets get you all thinking about some things, maybe go off and do a little research and some digging, listen to a podcast, whatever it might be, and then come back, because our next session will build on this. So let's jump to the next slide. And just to recap everything here, I spoke to the fact it's important we have to evolve. I've got plenty of experience. It does not make me good. I have to spend time growing, and I can assure you that my philosophy in coaching has completely been turned around over the last 30 years. And it's through questioning what I do. It's through saying, you know what, I was taught this way, but I'm not fully bought into this is the right way or the most effective. It's not that what we're doing is wrong. Is it the most effective? Is it the best use of our time? I think that we need to question how we do things, and the math is obvious. So take that with you. I want to point out the talent code. If you have not read this, there isn't any one single book that I believe captures what I'm trying to do philosophically. There's a lot of books out there about coaching, and there's probably 30 of them that I love. But this one really, it's pretty layman terms. It's easy to understand. It's an easy read, and it really sets the kind of the precedent of many of the elements that we'll touch on. When I go off and I listen to these other podcasts or I read other books, there's so much that ends up being referenced in this. So if you can download it and listen to it, there's also a link here to the TED Talk that Daniel actually gives. It's short, it's kind of old, and the quality is not great, but it gives a quick enlightenment to what he speaks to in his book. So take a moment to at least listen to that and get to know what the talent code's about. So that's all I have. Questions? Comment?
I have a question, Sean. So this goes back to that math you were talking about. You said the questions earlier. I said 90 hours. I was probably very optimistic. I understand there are some challenges in terms of, putting a lift that is probably in the works at some point in the future. What can we do to improve that, to increase that time that the athletes get on warm-up? Is it at all possible? Again, I don't know the cost structure of this for the mountain. I am far removed from that. But I've seen people in different venues do ski mobiles, like those machines that go up the mountain. Is it possible to implement something like that in the short term while you guys sort of working on those lift ideas for the future? I was just curious if it's at all possible to implement some of it, at least, maybe in the morning, maybe in the afternoon, wherever works, to carry athletes back and forth during that very intense training time that they have.
Yeah, there's nothing out there that's easy and cheap that we can implement at this point. Ultimately, when you do the math and you even use those, because when I was at Crested Butte, we had a hill that was dedicated to our team, and we had a Palmer right there, and we used that a lot. It didn't change the equation that much. It wasn't like this, okay, we're going to double our time on snow. Unfortunately, the lift alone is not the answer. It's just the reality of the sport. And we just have to look to, how do we maximize it? And some of that we'll again, there's more stuff coming down the pipeline when we go deeper into these series of discussions. But what can you do off snow? Are there things we can do off snow that helps motor skill development, that the athlete can do visualization? There are things they can do. So
can I make a comment actually directed to that?
Yeah, please.
I think that the athlete math is I think it's spot on. And I think we just have to consider what is it? It's 5 minutes of training or 20 minutes of training every hour. We have to just consider that to be background radiation. That's just the reality. So that's the baseline. And where I like to think about it is if instead of trying to think about ways to improve that, because that's a capital investment and that's a bigger pay grade structure to address. I think the opportunity is in coaching, and I think Caroline touched on it earlier, which is this idea of, for lack of a better term, and to use a bad pun, deliverance. We can all now imagine James Beattie on a ski lift. So the idea of being deliberate in our coaching and the way that we speak to athletes, I think that's what fundamentally changes the feedback cycle from a 15-minute feedback cycle to a tighter feedback cycle where you're in touch with the athlete, and that what you say and when you say it is fundamentally meaningful to the activity. And I think we all have a lot to learn to get better at that, because I think fundamentally that's the difference between an okay program and a pretty good program. I mean, we can even go better than that, but the point is, I was listening to something the other day and it struck me. It's this, I don't remember who was, some head coach, and he's like, in everything in your life, you only have 5 decisions, and you can be good at something, you can be okay at something, you can be lousy at something, or you can be like great at something, and you can be elite at something. And it's up to you to make a decision where you want to fit on that spectrum of excellence. And that shows in your athletes. Like when you care, it shows in your team and it shows in your athletes. It shows in all facets. And if I think if we ignore the lift issue, because that will always be there, and we are serious about what it is that we're doing, and we learn. And I think the beginning of all this is this presentation. It's taking this seriously. Everything matters.
Agreed. Thank you, Moshe. And there is some comments in here about the lift, and that's really not the purpose of this series. It's really, what can we do? What's within our control? And how do we, as coaches and as head coaches and even as parents, how do we maximize the training time on snow? And is there things we can do off snow to increase the learning? So I leave you all with that. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I think this is great, and I hope that it spreads and more people get involved. Shoot me an email if you've got a question you think of later that this brings up in your head. I'm happy to continue with this. And if a lot of the same questions come up, I know I need to answer it at the next session. And one of the nice things about doing a webinar is that we kind of have guest speakers. So I will be looking down the road to having guest speakers come in and letting other head coaches lead a webinar. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully you look forward to more of them, and hopefully it inspires you to get out there and do some digging and learn from some other sources outside us. So have a great night, everyone. Thank you.